When it comes to the Gospel of Mark, it's roundly agreed that his thesis is stated right out of the chute. In the opening line, Mark says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Here we have what's known as a genitive construction. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Genitive constructions can have a variety of meanings. Here, it's either a subjective genitive or an objective genitive. That is to say, it's either referring to the gospel as that which Jesus proclaimed, or it's referring to the gospel as that which is about or concerning Jesus Christ. Now, both of these are true. The gospel is what Jesus proclaimed, and it is or does center on the Lord Jesus Christ. For that reason, some scholars will refer to this as a kind of multivalent genitive. It's a genitive that intends to communicate both. It intends to communicate that this gospel is about Christ and is what Christ proclaimed. But certainly, if we have to choose here, that Mark's point would have to be that this is the gospel that is about Jesus. Okay? Again, it's not to deny that Jesus preached the gospel, but if a decision has to be made, then there's no doubt, in light of the connection between verse 1 and verse 2 and 3, that it's the gospel about Christ that has to be the uppermost notion in Mark's mind. But notice that Mark refers here to Jesus as the Son of God. Mark, in identifying this as the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has already told us who Jesus is. Now, many people want to reduce the title here, Son of God, to the word Messiah, because after all, the phrase Jesus Christ and Son of God are appositional in Greek. And so an appositional construction means that there's some fundamental relationship between two statements. In this case, Jesus Christ on the one hand and Son of God on the other. But the question is, what is the nature of this appositional relationship? For many people, the relationship is that Son of God is just another way of saying Christ. So that Son of God becomes nothing more than a way of identifying Jesus as the promised anointed king or the promised anointed descendant of David. And again, it's certainly true that Jesus was anointed. He is the Christ. He is the Son of David. The fact of the matter is that the phrase Son of God here cannot be meant in a reductionistic way. It can't be intended to be reducing the identity of Jesus merely to that of his office as the Messiah or the Messianic King. And for one reason is simply because the word Christ here isn't even being used as a title. The word Christ, you'll notice, is being used as though it were a proper name. This shows you that Mark is now writing sometime after the historical events that he's narrating, because here the word Christ has come to be used as part of Christ's proper name, whereas during the days of Christ's ministry, it was a title, not simply part of his proper name. And so if there was no other reason than that would be sufficient. The grammatical construction here is such that Son of God is not merely another way of saying Christ. It's a further description about Jesus. It goes beyond saying that Jesus is the Christ. Joel Marcus, he wrote an article on Mark 14:61 that appeared in Novum Testamentum, which is a journal on New Testament exegesis and theology. And what he points out is that even later in Mark's gospel, if you go, for example, to Mark 14:61, and this wouldn't be the only place, but Mark 14:61 being one place that's very prominent, you have a similar reference to Jesus as the Messiah, Son of God. And Joel Marcus makes the argument that the way we should understand this appositional construction is as a way of qualifying the kind of Messiah that Jesus is. But let me read what he said, and then I'll explain what he's talking about. In reference to Mark 14:61, Marcus says the two titles, that is, the Messiah and Son of the Blessed One, or Son of God, are in restrictive rather than non-restrictive apposition, so that the second qualifies the first. According to the definition of restrictive apposition stated above, that is, previously in the article, the first title, Christ, is viewed as a member of a class which can be linguistically identified only through the modification supplied by the second, the Son of God. The phrase, the Messiah, the Son of God, distinguishes this Messiah from any other Messiah the Markan characters and readers might have in mind. The second title, the Son of God, far from being a synonym for the Messiah, indicates what sort of messianic expectation is in view. Not the Messiah, son of David, nor the Messiah as the son of any other human being, but rather the Messiah, Son of God. So the basic point that Marcus is making here is that there's different ways you can understand this appositional construction when you have Messiah and Son of God situated next to each other grammatically. What he's arguing is that because there were various expectations of messianic figures, some Jewish sources, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the rabbinic literature of the Talmud, other sources will talk about, for example, the Messiah, the son of Aaron, or the Messiah of Israel, or the Messiah, son of David, or the Messiah ben Joseph. So there were various conceptions of Messiah, but there was also this expectation on the part of many Jews of a heavenly Messiah, or Messiah, the Son of God. Now, of course, the idea of a divine son, a heavenly Messiah, is not inconsistent or incompatible with other denominators like Messiah, son of David, but it goes beyond a mere identification of him as a son of David. And you, I think, can probably imagine a number of places in the Gospels where this is just the sort of thing in view. For example, in Mark chapter 12, Jesus, after having been questioned by the Herodians and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, then turns the tables on them and begins to ask them a question. And his question is, whose son is the Messiah? Is he the son of David? And they say yes. And then Jesus challenges them, in effect, if he's the son of David, why then did David call him Lord? The point that Jesus is making there is that the true identity of the Messiah goes well beyond merely being a descendant of David. And so this is what Mark is telling us already out of the chute. He's telling us that this Jesus is the Son of God. Okay? He's no merely human figure. He is the Son of the Father. Here is one clear example, again, of what Marcus is driving at. This, in fact, is the verse that he primarily had in mind. In Mark 14, starting in verse 53, we have Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and they're trying to bring down a verdict of guilty against him. They brought in their false witnesses. And then eventually, when this comes to naught, because the witnesses can't agree among themselves and Jesus won't self-incriminate, we're told in verse 60, then the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not offer us any answer for what these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not offer any answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and said to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Now, note carefully Christ's answer and the response of the high priest. The question that the high priest asked is, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Now, the contention here is that Son of the Blessed One is not just another way of saying the Christ, but is further identifying what kind of Messiah Jesus was identifying himself to be. In verse 62, Jesus said, I am, ego eimi, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Here, Jesus answers, he uses the self-asseveration formula used by God throughout the Old Testament, the divine I am, ego eimi, and then follows it up with a reference to the Son of Man of Daniel's prophecy. It's quite obviously a reference to Daniel 7, since he not only uses that pregnant phrase, Son of Man, but even echoes Daniel 7 and its reference to this one is riding the clouds of heaven. That same one that Daniel spoke of receiving dominion and glory and receiving universal worship, a term in Aramaic that is only ever used to refer to divine worship. So very clearly, Jesus is identifying himself as more than a human being. He's identifying himself as divine. He's affirming, in other words, the question of the high priest, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And note that Jesus' positive affirmation brings down this charge. In verse 63, it says, tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him as deserving of death. And some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and say to him, "Prophesy." Then the officers took custody of him and slapped him in the face. Well, here, quite obviously, the high priest doesn't think that Jesus has merely claimed to be a human Messiah, for such a claim doesn't carry with it the charge of blasphemy if you're not, in fact, who you're claiming to be. We have evidence for this, by the way, in abundance, but a couple of examples would be the references in certain rabbinic sources to Bar Kokhba claiming to be the Messiah. And then in another rabbinic witness, Akiva even attributes messianic status to Bar Kokhba. Now, neither one of these brought down the conclusion that these people were guilty of blasphemy. Bar Kokhba, though he proved to be a false Messiah, was not convicted of blasphemy and put to death for it. Neither was Rabbi Akiva, who's one of the most famed of the ancient rabbis. This was not a charge that was legitimately incurred against. It was not a charge that would bring down the guilt of blasphemy and the condemnation of death. But here the high priest thinks that what Jesus is claiming and claiming to be the Son, that he has blasphemed, that he has arrogated to himself the divine name or prerogatives or a divine identity. In fact, here is Marcus. He says, one of the main problems with taking Christ and Son of the Blessed as synonyms is that the charge of blasphemy in 1463 through 64 then becomes difficult to understand. Why should Jesus claim to be the Messiah, the Son of God, be considered blasphemous if Son of God is merely a synonym for Messiah? What is blasphemous about claiming to be the Messiah? One searches Jewish literature in vain for evidence that a simple claim to be the Messiah would incur such a charge.